I should mention that the chairman of our board, Bill Broadbeck, is here today with his wife, Jan, Dr. Jan Piwanka. Could they stand up, please? And also our trustee, former governor of Nebraska, Kay Orr, is here today. Stand up, Kay. Today, for the first time in history, we have governors of Nebraska running out our ears. I've long grown accustomed to living my life under the command of 18-year-olds, and as my age increases and my time here increases, I've come to see that after they grow up, they still order me about all the time. And that explains Governor Ricketts' presence here today, apart from his good nature. We have about 4,000 kids here. Actually, we have about 45 kids here from Nebraska at any given time. And they're very distinctive. As far as we can tell, the only reason anybody ever leaves Nebraska is to come to Hillsdale College. And great strings of them have come from Nebraska, including from the family of Governor Orr, whose grandchildren all come here. There are 3 of them in my line of sight, 2 of them in my line of sight right now. And 2 of my former students work in the governor's office. And they started telling me a few months ago that this guy's really great. And that's a high standard around here because we believe in limited government, and that's in short supply in America today. No, he's really great. Most recent, well, the senior one is Taylor Gage over there, and most recent is Luke Robson, student last year of mine. And they're both pretty smart, although you can't tell it by looking at them. And so they mobbed up with Michael Lucchese and some other people, and they presented me with the fact that Governor Ricketts is coming. And I thought, okay, I guess I should look this guy up now. And what do I find? Well, first of all, he comes from an entrepreneurial family, and he's worked in the great businesses founded by that family. TD Ameritrade, the largest business probably, but also famously the Chicago Cubs. And I'm a radical baseball fan. And so I do believe very much that it's unconstitutional for the Red Sox to win the World Series because they traded the Babe, and there's no forgiving that. But the Cubs didn't really do anything that bad. There's various stories to explain why they lost for more than a century. But they stopped when his family took over. And I've talked to the governor's father once, and I've talked at length to his brother recently. And I find that one of the reasons that they were able to turn that team around and make themselves beloved in that city is because they are people of real ability, but also such good character. They are giving people. They are friendly people. They are well-meaning people. They are energetic people. And they are tough, as you have to be a governor of a state. This particular governor is getting the government under control. I questioned Luke Robson, who stopped by my house uninvited, as they do around here, to talk to me about all of this, just to make sure I was going to do a good job. And I questioned the governor's resume, and I said, okay, he's cut the rate of growth of the government of Nebraska by 90%. What is it now? 25%? And he said, no, he said it's lower than the rate of inflation. Now that is breathtaking in this day and age. And that requires skill and toughness and conviction. And since this governor is a highly successful businessman, there's no reason he needs the grief that comes with that. And yet he doesn't even see it as grief. Remarkable man. I'm proud to present to you the governor of Nebraska, Pete Ricketts.
No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. Government programs, once launched, never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we're ever going to see on this earth. Many of you recognize that as a quote from Ronald Reagan, talking directly at the topic of our discussion today around taming the Leviathan, reducing the size and scope of government. But before we get into that, I want to thank Dr. Arnn and the members of Omicron Delta Kappa for inviting me to be here today. It's an especial honor and privilege for me because, as Dr. Arnn was describing, there's a lot of connections between Hillsdale College and Nebraska. As he mentioned, Nebraska's got the third largest contingent of students here, despite the small population of our state. We also have the connection that one of the alums from Hillsdale Preparatory was actually governor of Nebraska back in the early 20th century and a Supreme Court justice. We've got at least one sitting city council member, City of Kearney, who's a Hillsdale alum. And of course, as Dr. Arnn mentioned, our Governor Orr is also on your board of trustees, and she's a mentor of mine. So there's a lot of connections there, and so it makes it a special privilege for me to be able to be here and talk to you about this very important topic, taming the Leviathan. And that really gets at the struggle that we've got here in the 21st century that we've been having for a number of years about the size and scope of government. How do we grapple with this? Now, when Hobbes wrote the Leviathan back in 1651, he was actually writing in defense of the monarchy. And in his view, the Leviathan was this big government that was going to protect our rights and for the common good. And I think it's kind of ironic because if we think about a Leviathan, well, a Leviathan comes from the Bible, right? And it is a sea monster. That's something you fight against, you're scared of. And of course, that's the way that us as conservatives, we feel about the growth of government. Now, this is not something new. When Thomas Jefferson wrote nearly 230 years ago, he said the natural course of things is for liberty to yield and for government to gain ground. Or said another way by Ronald Reagan, as government expands, liberty contracts. But our founders, I think, would be surprised by the conversations we are having today, the debates we're having. Remember, at the founding of our republic, they were debating whether or not they should have a standing army, or if the government should be allowed to enforce the payment of taxes. It's a very different conversation we're having today about the size and scope of government. And in fact, for most of our history as a country, most of the governing was done at the state and local level, which we as conservatives appreciate. Because we believe that government closest to the people is going to be the most accountable, be the most responsive. But then in the middle of the 20th century, we had the New Deal and World War II. Now, up until that time, most Americans didn't really have that much interface with the federal government, except maybe the post office, or if there was a war. But starting in 1940, most of the spending in our country started to happen at the federal government. Before then, it was all done at the state and local level. But in 1940, it started going the wrong way, and it's gone the wrong way ever since. So we, as conservatives, have been thinking about how do we restrain that? How do we slow that growth down? And we've had a number of different strategies to be able to try that. Some of them have been successful. You think back to the welfare reform in the 1990s, which I might point out started in the state of Wisconsin. Some that have not been successful. George Bush tried to reform Social Security. That didn't work out so well. We've tried to actually reform entitlements by creating entitlements. I'm thinking of Medicare Part D. And that's problematic because any time you create an entitlement, you've created a constituency, replete with lobbyists that are there to support it. That's why it's so difficult to get rid of them. We've also tried to restrain the spending through things such as the budget cap. Don't borrow any more money. And frankly, every time that happens, we create a crisis and we lose in the court of public opinion. Now, this doesn't mean we should give up, that we should stop trying to figure out how we restrain the growth of government. But it does mean that we've got to rethink our strategy for how we as conservatives are going to win this battle. In fact, I would say we don't really even have a clearly articulated strategy for how we're going to do this. So we've got to rethink that. And I'm going to give 3 things that we can do in that battle to control government spending. The first of which, we need to continue to look for ways that we can rethink entitlements. The second is we need to focus when we are the governors, when we're in power as conservatives, we've got to make sure government is working for the people. Third, we've got to support the voluntary organizations in our society that really strengthen the fabric of our society. And I'll get into each one of those and talk about why they're so important. Let's start with the first, with entitlements. Now, the CBO has said that by 2031, 16 years away, I plan on being around. I know the young people are still going to be around here. This is not very far away. For the folks who are in college, that probably seems like a long time, 16 years. But when you get to be, and I'm older than Doug, I'm 53 now, that's not very far away. 16 years between entitlements, the spending the federal government does on health care, and the debt, that will take up the entire budget. The entire budget. That means nothing of what the proper functions of government are, like, say, the defense, national defense, or infrastructure. That'll all be crowded out. And that's why we have to focus on how we rethink. We talk about entitlements. And I'm going to 2 ways that we should focus on that. First of all, whenever we're talking about entitlements, we should think about what is the actual goal for the entitlement? What are we trying to accomplish? And second of all, we should push that responsibility down to the states so that they can manage it. We've done this in Nebraska. We've started rethinking about entitlements and how we implement them. We've rethought that by really looking at what is the goal. So, for example, in our Department of Labor, we have an unemployment program. Well, what's the goal of an unemployment program? It's not just to pay people money. The goal is to help people get a job. And so we've changed our unemployment system into a first-in-the-nation reemployment program. And by that I mean everybody seeking those benefits has to sit down with a jobs coach first before they can collect those benefits. Get coaching on how they find their next job. Have to create a resume. And that resume is searchable online so that companies can proactively reach out to that person and say, hey, you've got the job skills I need. Would you think about coming and taking this job? By focusing on the goal, which is really to help somebody get their next job, we've been able to reduce the amount of time people are unemployed. In fact, we've reduced the number of benefits, the week's benefits claimed, by 20%. We've reduced the amount of people reaching the end of their benefits by over 30%. We've been able to reduce the amount of claims that we paid out last year by nearly $14 million. And that allowed us to reduce our unemployment insurance tax this year by 25%. And we project that'll save Nebraska businesses $17.6 million this year. Folks, that's a win-win-win. It's a win for the person who's looking for a job. It's a win for the employers who need people to be able to grow. And it's a win for the taxpayer because we're paying out less in benefits. We're actually shrinking that entitlement. We've got another program, again, leveraging the same idea around our SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or commonly called food stamps. And what we've done there is said, what is the goal? Well, the goal, again, is not just to send out money, but the goal is to help that family feed themselves. And the best way, the most sustainable way for a family to take care of themselves, if they can do it because they got a good job. So we've broken down the barriers between our Health and Human Services and our Department of Labor. And we ran a pilot in Grand Island, Nebraska, where we had the Department of Labor go work with our families on SNAP, voluntary program, to help them get better jobs. And about half the families, we were able to help do that. In fact, on average, we raised those families we were able to help we raised their annual income by $6,900. One woman in particular was a single mom working, hourly jobs, making about $900 a month, irregular hours, no pension, no benefits. We helped her get a job paying $2,700 a month with benefits, potential for bonuses and a pension, and even more importantly, regular hours so she could be home at night with her kids. Again, folks, that's a win-win. And what we've done is we've been able to reduce those families' reliance on SNAP. In fact, some of them got off it entirely by rethinking about what are we actually trying to accomplish. Well, we're trying to help those families take care of themselves. It's not just about sending out money. And if we can allow states to continue to innovate that and push that responsibility down to the states, we'll see more innovations like we're doing in Nebraska. And what may work in Nebraska may not work in New Jersey and vice versa. That's why we want the states to do this. That's one of the things if we really want to tackle this problem of entitlements, we've got to take that responsibility out of Washington, D.C., push it back to the states, let the states innovate, and rethink what our goals are. It's important as well from another standpoint. We had the whole debate in Nebraska about Medicaid expansion. And we are not an expansion state. And one of the arguments we were able to successfully use was that, look, Medicaid is designed for children, elderly, the disabled. If you make it about able-bodied single adults, you are taking away from this population, the children, the disabled, the elderly, who truly need our help. You're diluting the message of what Medicaid is about. And that was one of the arguments that helped us prevent us from expanding Medicaid in our state. So focus on what the entitlements are about, give the responsibility back to the states. Second thing, when we are governing, when conservatives are the ones running the government, we've got to make sure it runs really, really well. We've got to focus on making it run like a business. In fact, I believe that's one of the reasons why the citizens of Nebraska hired me as governor, because I promised to run government more like a business. Now, I got a lot of criticism. Some people said, well, government's not a business. Can't run like a business. Well, it's true that government's not a business. We're not for profit. But we provide services, we have expenses, and frankly, there are four things in common to any organization that is going to be successful, whether you're a private sector, for-profit business, a nonprofit, a government, or even a baseball team. And that's you got to have a vision for what you're going to do. You have to evangelize that vision both inside and outside your organization so that everybody knows what your organization's about. You have to get the best people available to run that organization, and you have to hold them accountable for results. And let me tell you, folks, that doesn't happen very often in government. I can tell you from my experience, when I walked into the governor's office, we didn't have basic things like job descriptions or annual reviews. We collected lots of data but used none of it to set goals, to hold people accountable. We had lots of data but no measurements. But by applying those things to running government, we've actually seen tremendous impact on how we provide our services. And we're bringing a crucial theme that is very foreign to state government, which is you can deliver great services and control your costs at the same time. Now, in the real world, you have to do that all the time, right? Private sector companies, if they're not figuring out how they can do a better job serving their customers and bringing their costs down at the same time, they're going to go out of business. Well, nobody's going to put the government out of business, which is why we have to drive this from the top down, from the governor's office on through all of our organizations. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of how we've been able to do this, or what we've done. We've put everybody in my organization through Lean Six Sigma White Belt training, 12,500 people, to let them know why do we do process improvement? Why do we treat people like customers? And let's go back to that SNAP program. The Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, we have an 800 number that people sign up for that. In August of 2014, before I took over, it was taking us nearly 24 minutes on average to answer that phone call. It was taking us 40 days to process those applications. But by focusing on process improvement, not adding more money to the budget, just doing a better job of what we were doing, streamlining those, taking out the useless complexity, getting rid of the waste. We set a goal of 5 minutes or less to answer the phone. We've hit it at 17 out of 19 months. We set a goal of 10 days or less to process those applications. We've hit that 14 out of the last 18 months. And here's the deal. We're changing that philosophy, that mentality in government. Because before, everybody thought, well, the only way you can improve services is if you spent more money. And we're showing, no, you can actually improve services while you spend less money. Because, as Dr. Arndt said, we cut the budget. In my first budget, we cut the growth rate from 6.5%, almost in half, and now we've cut it to that 0.6%. So we're doing a better job of delivering services, not only in health and human services, but in things like issuing tax credits back to people or permits. All these processes can be improved. We're doing a better job of delivering on those, even though we are cutting the budget. And that's the important mind shift that we've got to have when we're governing, that we can do a better job delivering services and reduce our costs. Because here's the deal, folks. People don't want no government. Very few people want no government. There are some that do. But what people are frustrated by is that government doesn't work. And if we can show that government can work, we can serve the people and control costs, we'll keep getting sent back to keep doing it. So that's the second thing. And the third thing has to do with voluntary organizations. Voluntary organizations are fundamental to who we are as Americans. It is part of our heritage and our legacy as Americans. And it's important for two reasons. One, it's going to help us be able to provide for the people who truly need our help in society. And it's a part of maintaining our unique system of self-government. On that first part, it's important because we in government, we do provide a lot of important services. We build roads that people go to see their families on, go to work on. We protect the public safety. But for all the people who need our help in society, there's one thing we in government cannot do. We can't love. Only people can love. And those people have to be local in your community to be able to do that. Because for the people who need our help, the path to recovery is not a straight line. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And on that step back, somebody has got to be there to love them back on that pathway to success. That requires a person. That's not going to come from the government. So we have to have these voluntary organizations in our communities to be able to provide that if we truly want to help our neighbors who need our help. And it is important to maintaining our system of self-government that we have these voluntary organizations because they're outside of government. If we want to talk about self-government, we can't have the answer always be government. It's got to be other organizations. And if you bear with me a moment, I'm going to read a quote here from Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which they all take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, grave, futile, very general, and very particular, immense and very small. Americans use associations to give feasts, to found seminaries, to build inns, to raise churches, to distribute books, to send missionaries on the Antipodes. In this manner, they create hospitals, prisons, schools. Finally, if it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of a great example, they associate. Everywhere that at the head of a new undertaking you see the government in France and a great lord in England, count on it that you will perceive an association in the United States. In America, I encountered sorts of associations of which I confess I had no idea. And I often admired the infinite art with which the inhabitants of the United States managed to fix a common goal to the efforts of many men and to get them to advance it freely. Folks, our voluntary organizations in our society are fundamental and critical to our very republic because it gets at that self-governance outside of the United States to be able to solve problems and say not everything needs that government hammer to be able to be fixed. And so we need to encourage that. Now, as governor, I have the opportunity to do that in a variety of ways. Certainly, as governor, you can bring people together and you can set the agenda. You can set the tone. So I attend all sorts of charity functions. I actually rent out or hold dinners, give away dinners to auction dinners. We, in our sesquicentennial year, our 150th year of statehood, are promoting volunteerism as part of our overall celebration of our statehood. My wife's got an initiative called Bringing Up Nebraska, which is about organizing all of our nonprofits as well as our state agencies and county and so forth in our communities to be able to leverage all those resources so we can do a better job providing those for the families that need it. There's all sorts of things that we can do to encourage our voluntary organizations in our society, and we have to strengthen that very fabric of civil society and reinforce that self-governance does not mean government. So those are the things that we need to think about as conservatives. Now, one of the things, just as I wrap up here, I want to impress upon you. The left is really, really good at incrementalism. They are very patient. They get something, they come back the next year and ask for a little bit more. We've got to think along the same lines. We've got to be patient. We've got to be persistent. We've got to think about how we rethink entitlements around our goals and pushing that responsibility back to the states where that responsibility belongs. When we're in power, we've got to make sure government works for the people, because that's how we change that mindset around what government is all about, that we can actually do a better job delivering services and bring our costs down at the same time. Those two ideas are not mutually incompatible. And we've got to strengthen our voluntary organizations, those civic organizations that provide so much service that aren't government, that are part of how we self-govern, that has nothing to do with anything that has involved in the government. That's part of how we start turning the tide here, how we start taming that Leviathan of big government and bring it back under control the way our founders originally intended. Thank you for what you all do as a part of that debate, dialogue. Hillsdale is known where people talk about big ideas. And so you all play an important role in making sure we have this conversation about how we properly govern ourselves and make sure we live up to the fundamental ideas and ideals that the founders of this republic knew would make us the greatest country the world has ever seen. God bless you all for what you do, and God bless the United States of America. And with that, I think we might have time for one or two questions. Dr. Arnn, you're going to give me the hook when it's time, right?
Yeah, carry on.
Carry on, he says. Okay. So obviously, if you have to leave, go ahead and leave. If you want to skip class, I'll write you a note afterwards. I don't know if it'll do you any good. But do we have any questions? Really? I did that good a job. Oh, we got questions. Here we go. We got questions over here.
Thank you, sir. I wonder at what point you see government's role in rethinking entitlements should be entirely given over to voluntary associations. Is there at some point where we want to decrease government's role there so that it's really done by the fabric of society?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that we can do this, we absolutely should make it the most, because, again, getting back to that point where if you really want to help people, you need to have somebody love them. You gotta have that personal contact. You know, Ronald Reagan said we can't help everybody, but everybody can help somebody. So we should be thinking as much as possible. Now, where does that line get drawn? From a pragmatic standpoint, it's going to be tough because we've created such a huge bureaucracy around this. It's going to be tough. And there's a lot of people that have got a lot of big money stakes involved in this, folks, which means they hire lobbyists and they spend a lot of money to make sure that those entitlements don't go away. So it's going to be very challenging, but the way we tackle this gets back to one of the things I said, which is give it back to the states. Take it away from the federal government, give it back to the states. I know you all had a conversation about health care. Graham Cassidy would have been a great way to be able to do that for the health care marketplace. Now, it's not the system we all would have designed as conservatives, but given where we are today, Graham Cassidy was a great solution to cap our liability on Medicaid expansion, because right now, folks, I don't know if you know this, We have an unlimited liability for Medicaid expansion today. There is no end to the amount of money we can spend on this. It just goes up and up and up. And so Graham-Cassidy would have capped that, and it would have pushed that money back to the states in the form of block grants to let us come up with solutions on how we can solve that. And when we're thinking about entitlements, we need to do that. We need to push the responsibility back to the states, let them design it, and be able to kind of cap what we're spending there so that we can be successful in managing our budgets. And that will also encourage us to involve those civic organizations that are in our communities to be able to be part of the solutions, and that's how we can start bringing them in as this overall conversation and reduce the reliance on government. So I don't have an exact line of where we can cut it off and say, okay, it's got to be a civic organization, not a government organization, but we know we're going far too the wrong, direction wrong way toward the government. We've got to reverse that and start heading it back to our communities to be able to truly help the people who need our help. Got a question over here?
Hello, Governor.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm Rob from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and wanted to follow up on your comments on the healthcare opportunity, presuming you get the opportunity to manage a block grant from the federal government for healthcare insurance. What are some of the prime points that you'd like to see implemented to be ideally best practices for 49 states, D.C., and other places to implement?
Well, what we want to do is make sure that we're not, the first thing is we don't want to displace the private marketplace. We want to make sure that our private insurers actually are insuring the people who can actually afford to pay for it. So what are some of the ideas around that? And if we get the opportunity, what are some of the things? Well, in any business, 20% of your customers are probably driving 80% of your expenses. So if we can isolate that group that is driving our expenses, and maybe that's how you use the federal government's money, our money, to be able to address those folks that are going to be your high costs, move them out of that pool so the rest of the insurance pool is less expensive. You can make it more affordable for everybody else. That's an example of one of the things we could look at. But ultimately what we want to drive at is not that the government's paying insurance premiums, but that people can afford to buy insurance. So let's get rid of some of the mandates. Let people have more choice. In just about every industry where we have high quality and low cost, we have consumers making choices. We allow consumers to make expensive decisions around buying a house and buying a car. Why should this be any different? We have to drive it back to the consumers, making that trade-off between what do they want to pay, what do they want to get in return, and that's what's going to make health care affordable, and ultimately, that's how we can make sure everybody has it.
Thank you. My question is this. I'm from California.
I'm sorry.
Can we get you to come to our state? And in other words, what I'm thinking is that you do have something that should be packaged some way where it's transportable, and you can get other minds, even if they're in opposition to you, to understand the logical reasonability of it and try to get other states on board like that. I think it's essential if the United States is going to survive. We can't have isolated states that are doing a good job and everybody else says, well, big deal. We need to get the public educated too, because it's hard as a citizen for me to even communicate on any kind of a level, on the federal level, or to get ideas, to them. So I'm wondering, maybe you could work with some of the other governors that feel like you do, and get a quorum going where you can move around the states and at least suggest ideas or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's actually one of the geniuses of our system is the federalism, that we have 50 states that can implement ideas, and I'm a big believer in stealing other people's good ideas. And in fact, I do work, we've got the Republican Governors Association, and so I work with my colleagues around sharing best practices and so forth that way. But you're exactly right. I believe that we in Nebraska can implement programs that you can look at in other states and say, we could do the same thing. And it might not be exactly what we do in Nebraska, but that's part of what we should be thinking about is how, again, if you push the responsibility back to the states, let them come up with ideas. Some will work, some won't. But take the ideas that work and then copy them from other states. So we try to do that all the time in my administration. One of my first questions is, has anybody else got this problem and what are they doing to solve it? Child welfare, for example, is one of the ones that it's a tough nut to crack. How do you provide these services? And frankly, I don't know that there's any state that's doing it well. But we go out and we look to see what are other best practices. And certainly we try to, again, I work with some of my colleagues. There's probably other ways that we can get that word out there. But this is actually, frankly, one of them, by talking about the things we're doing in Nebraska that are unique, like our reemployment program, what we've been doing with SNAP, to try and rethink how we do entitlements, to get the word out there, to let other people think about that too.
My boss, hello. My boss, Kathleen, says this is the last question, so I'm going to ask it.
Is that fair?
You were Chief Operating Officer of TD Ameritrade, and the difference between that and what you're doing now is that everybody working for you now is working for the government. How's that different, and how do you cope with it?
So it is true that in our divided form of government, right, we've got 3 branches, and as the governor, when I put together a budget, it's not really a budget, it's more like a suggestion. So I make a recommendation to the legislature, but of course they've got the purse strings. And that's where you have to work together to be able to make that happen. And in fact, I had to veto out some accounting gimmicks and some tax increases and some spending in our last budget. But it's actually a lower threshold to override my vetoes in Nebraska than it is to actually break a filibuster. So I worked with the conservative senators to explain to them, here's what we're doing. Actually, it was a collaborative effort. I said we could take some deep cuts in these areas, or we could do a broad-based cut. We talked about how we would manage these cuts. So, for example, we're talking about cutting some of our provider rate pools. We have these pools of money that we pay people like in Child and Family Services or Medicaid. We said, here's how we're going to manage these cuts so that providers don't see a rate cut. And we brought them along to be able to sustain those vetoes. So it's a much more collaborative. You have to, it just takes longer to go through the process than if you're, say, a chief operating officer and you're setting a budget, and then that's the budget. When it's come to things such as really getting this process improvement going, we've really had no pushback. Occasionally when we walk into a department, they'll say, oh, you're here to fire us, aren't you? You're putting these measurements in, you're going to fire us. We're like, no, we're actually here to show you how you can have job satisfaction. Because we're going to set goals, and when you reach them, you know you're doing a good job. Can you imagine the kind of job where you're just processing paperwork all day and you have no idea whether or not it means anything or whether you're doing a good job? So as we've been implementing our reforms, frankly, and again, if you know anything about Lean Six Sigma, you know it involves the frontline people getting together to come up with the solutions. So we've had people, you know, at first be a little hesitant, but once you get past that and they see what the process is really like, they're on board. So it is. The process is, you know, when you're in government, it takes longer. You know, we're talking about changing a culture. And even in the private sector, it takes years to change a culture. I know my family's been through it with the Chicago Cubs. They were the lovable losers. And that would be another whole 20-minute presentation talking about that, about how we change that around. But you can change the culture. It takes time. But we are doing it in Nebraska to get people to think differently about how we run the government so that we can actually be that organization that is operationally excellent. That is our goal. We're about operational excellence. We're about delivering better services, about controlling costs. It's the same thing we did at Ameritrade. We were about operational excellence. Takes a little bit longer in government, but you can absolutely do it. And that's part of, again, getting to that second point, that's what we've got to do as conservatives. When we're governing, we've got to make sure we're making government work for the people so we can keep earning their trust and their votes and keep getting sent back so we can keep making changes. Well, again, folks, thank you all very much for having me here today. It's been an honor and a pleasure. I very much appreciate you taking the time. Dr. Arnn, thank you very much. You all have a great rest of the day and a great week.